I learned that ghosts do not haunt the living to frighten us, but to remind us that love does not end with exile or silence or even death. And on the night my husband came to me, half frozen and delirious in that forgotten castle, I understood at last that the spirits had been preparing me all along for the moment when I would have to choose between justice and mercy. My name is Cordelia Fairfax Drummond, and I was once the Duchess of Dunverin, though that title feels now like something borrowed from another woman's life. I write this account not to seek pity, nor to cast blame upon the man who sent me away, but to preserve the truth of what happened in those snow-buried weeks in the Scottish Highlands, where I discovered that the walls between this world and the next are thinner than silk, and that redemption can come to those who least expect it, carried on the wings of a winter storm. I was 23 years old when I married Alistair Drummond, the 7th Duke of Dunverin. He was 12 years my senior, a man of imposing height and stern countenance, with eyes the color of a Highland loch in winter, and a jaw that seemed carved from the same granite as his ancestral mountains. Our marriage was arranged by our families, as was the custom among our kind, but I will confess that I harbored tender feelings for him from our very first meeting. There was something in the way he looked at me, a flicker of warmth beneath that icy exterior, that made me believe he might one day come to care for me in return. I remember the day we were introduced as vividly as if it were yesterday. It was at a garden party hosted by the Countess of Ashworth, one of those interminable affairs where young ladies of good breeding were paraded before eligible gentlemen like horses at auction. I had been standing beneath a rose arbor, trying to escape the notice of a particularly persistent Lord Whitmore who had been following me all afternoon with his damp palms and his eager compliments, when I looked up and saw Alistair watching me from across the lawn. He did not smile. He did not approach. He simply stood there, tall and dark and utterly still, his eyes fixed on my face with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. I felt as if he were seeing through all the layers of silk and propriety to something real beneath, something I had kept hidden even from myself. And when our eyes met, when I felt that electric connection spark across the distance between us, I knew that my life was about to change. Our courtship, if it could be called that, was formal and brief. Alistair called upon my father the very next week, stating his intentions with the same directness he brought to all his dealings. My father, delighted at the prospect of his daughter becoming a duchess, gave his blessing without hesitation. I was consulted, of course, asked if I found the Duke acceptable, if I had any objections to the match. I said no. I said I would be honored. I said all the things a proper young lady was supposed to say. But what I felt was something far more complicated. I felt hope, bright and fierce and terrifying. I felt desire, though I barely understood what that word meant. I felt the stirring of something that might have been love, or might have been its precursor, waiting to bloom if only given the chance. We were married 3 months later, in a cathedral filled with flowers and dignitaries, my gown a froth of white lace that had taken 6 seamstresses 8 weeks to complete. Alistair stood at the altar like a statue, his face betraying no emotion, but when he took my hand to slip the ring onto my finger, his touch was gentle, almost reverent. And when he spoke his vows, his voice was low but steady, as if he were making promises not just to me, but to himself. The wedding night was a revelation. I had been warned by my married friends to expect something clinical and uncomfortable, a duty to be endured rather than enjoyed. But Alistair was patient with me, more patient than I would have expected from such a reserved man. He let me set the pace, responding to my hesitations with reassurance rather than impatience. And when at last we came together, there was tenderness in his touch, a gentleness that seemed at odds with his stern exterior. I fell asleep that night, thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, I had not been wrong to hope. For the first year of our union, I thought my hopes were being realized. Alistair was not a demonstrative man. He did not speak words of love or shower me with compliments, but he was attentive in his own reserved way. He would ask about my day, remember my preferences for tea and music, and sometimes I would catch him watching me across the drawing room with an expression that made my heart quicken. I believed we were building something real, something that might one day bloom into the kind of love my parents had shared before my mother passed. I worked hard to be a good wife to him. I learned the intricacies of managing a ducal household, the endless details of menus and staff and social obligations. I studied his moods, learned when to approach him and when to give him space, learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression that revealed what his words never would. I threw myself into the role of Duchess with all the determination I possessed, wanting nothing more than to make him proud, to prove myself worthy of the trust he had placed in me. And slowly, incrementally, the walls between us began to lower. He started joining me for breakfast instead of taking his meal alone in his study. He began asking my opinion on matters of household management, then on matters of estate business, then on matters of politics and philosophy. He smiled more often, laughed more readily, and sometimes in the evenings he would sit beside me on the settee instead of in his usual chair across the room, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. I began to believe that he was falling in love with me. I began to believe that we might have a real marriage, not just an arrangement, but a partnership, not just duty, but devotion. I began to believe that I had found something rare and precious, something worth protecting at any cost. Then came Lord Sebastian Hale. Sebastian was Alistair's closest friend from their years at Oxford. They had been inseparable as young men, bound by the particular affection that forms between boys on the cusp of manhood. When Sebastian returned from 3 years abroad, having traveled through Italy and Greece in search of artistic inspiration, Alistair welcomed him into our home with an enthusiasm I had never seen in my husband before. For the first time, I witnessed Alistair laugh freely, argue passionately about philosophy and art, and shed the armor of reserve that he wore like a second skin. I was glad for it. I thought that Sebastian's presence might help my husband open his heart more fully, might teach him by example that expressing joy and affection was not a weakness. What I did not anticipate was that Sebastian would become my friend as well. It began innocently enough. Sebastian was charming and cultured, with a gift for conversation that put everyone at ease. He had a way of making you feel as if you were the most interesting person in the room, as if your thoughts and opinions mattered more than anyone else's. He was handsome too, I will not deny it, with golden hair that curled rakishly over his forehead and eyes the color of summer sky. But his beauty was the beauty of a painting, something to be admired from a distance. It never stirred in me the feelings that Alistair's stern face and dark eyes evoked. Sebastian had traveled to places I had only read about in books, seen paintings and sculptures that existed for me only as engravings in art folios. When he spoke of Florence at sunset, or the ruins of Athens by moonlight, I listened with the hunger of a woman who had never been permitted to venture far from the drawing rooms of London society. He lent me books of poetry and essays that my governesses would never have approved. He treated me as an intellectual equal, asking my opinions and genuinely considering my answers. I loved my husband. Let me be clear about that. Whatever warmth I felt for Sebastian was the warmth of friendship, of gratitude for someone who saw me as more than an ornament or a vessel for producing heirs. But I was naive. I did not understand how easily friendship could be misconstrued, how quickly innocent gestures could be twisted into evidence of betrayal. The conversations we shared were always in public, always in full view of the household. We spoke of literature and art, of philosophy and travel, of the ideas that fascinated us both. Never once did Sebastian say anything improper. Never once did he touch me in a way that could be considered forward. He was Alistair's friend first and foremost, and he treated me with the respect due to his friend's wife. But there were those in our household who saw things differently. Lady Marguerite Drummond was Alistair's sister-in-law, the widow of his elder brother Charles, who had died 5 years before our marriage in a hunting accident. She had remained part of the family, maintaining apartments in the London townhouse and the Edinburgh estate, serving as the unofficial hostess for Alistair's social obligations before I came along. She was a handsome woman in her middle years, with sharp features and sharper eyes, and from the moment of our first meeting, I sensed that she did not welcome my presence. I tried to befriend her. I deferred to her experience in household matters, sought her advice on entertaining, praised her taste in decoration and dress, but nothing I did seemed to soften her attitude toward me. She remained cool, distant, watching me with an expression that I could never quite interpret. I told myself it was natural, that she must be struggling to relinquish her position of authority, that given time she would come to accept me as part of the family. I did not realize until much later that her feelings toward me were not merely resentful, but actively hostile. Marguerite had hoped, I learned afterward, to maintain her influence over Alistair indefinitely. She had imagined herself as the power behind the ducal throne, managing the household and advising on estate matters, perhaps even arranging a marriage for her brother-in-law that would keep power firmly within her grasp. My arrival had upset all her carefully laid plans. I was young and educated, capable of managing a household and serving as hostess, capable of giving Alistair the companionship and counsel that Marguerite had hoped to provide. I was, in short, a threat. And when Sebastian arrived and began spending time with me, when she saw us laughing together over books and debating points of philosophy, she saw her opportunity. The accusation came on a November evening, 3 weeks after Sebastian had departed for London. Alistair summoned me to his study, a room I rarely entered, and when I saw his face, I knew that something had shattered beyond repair. He stood by the fire, a letter crumpled in his fist, and the look in his eyes was not anger, but something far worse. It was devastation. The study was dark, lit only by the fire and a single lamp on his desk. The shadows seemed to press in from all sides, and I felt suddenly cold, as if a draught had entered the room from some unseen source. Alistair did not move as I approached. He simply stood there, his broad shoulders rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. He asked me only one question. Was it true that I had given myself to Sebastian Hale? I was so stunned by the accusation that I could not speak. The words lodged in my throat like shards of ice, and my silence, I realized too late, was taken as confession. I tried to explain, tried to tell him that Sebastian and I had never been anything but friends, that the letter, whoever had written it, was lying. But Alistair would not hear me. His face had turned to stone, and his voice, when he spoke again, was colder than any Highland winter. He told me that I had humiliated him, betrayed his trust and his name. He told me that he could not bear to look at me, could not share a house with a woman who had given to another man what should have been his alone. He told me that I would be sent away, immediately, to the most remote property in his family's holdings, a place called Dunverin Castle, deep in the Scottish Highlands. I would remain there indefinitely, seen by no one, spoken of to no one, as good as dead to the world. I begged him to listen. I wept and pleaded and swore on my mother's grave that I was innocent. But something had broken inside my husband, some essential trust that could not be mended with words. He turned his back to me, and the last thing I saw before the footman came to escort me to my rooms was the rigid set of his shoulders, as if he were bracing himself against a blow that had already fallen. That night was the longest of my life. I paced my bedchamber like a caged animal, my mind racing through every possibility, every explanation, every avenue of escape. I wrote letters to Alistair, page after page of frantic protestations, but they were intercepted before they could reach him. I tried to see him, but the servants had been instructed to keep me confined to my rooms. I was a prisoner in my own home, condemned without trial, denied even the chance to face my accuser. I was permitted to pack a single trunk. I was given no chance to say goodbye to the friends I had made in London society, no opportunity to write to my father or my younger sister. Within 12 hours of that terrible interview, I was bundled into a carriage and sent north, Accompanied only by a silent maidservant named Agnes, who had been instructed, I soon learned, to report my every word and action to my husband. The journey took 8 days. We traveled through rain and mud, through villages that grew smaller and more scattered as we climbed into the mountains. The landscape changed from gentle English countryside to wild Scottish moors, vast expanses of purple heather and grey stone that seemed to stretch to the edge of the world. I watched it all through the carriage window, feeling as though I were traveling not just through space, but through time, retreating further and further from everything I had known. Agnes was no comfort to me. She was a thin, pinched woman with a face like a closed door, and she responded to my attempts at conversation with monosyllables or silence. She watched me constantly, her pale eyes following my every movement, and I knew that whatever I said or did would be reported back to Edinburgh. I stopped trying to speak to her after the 3rd day, retreating into my own thoughts, my own grief, my own desperate attempts to understand how my life had come to this. I thought about Alistair constantly. I replayed our courtship, our wedding, every moment of our marriage, searching for signs that I had missed, warnings that I had ignored. Had he ever truly trusted me? Had he ever truly cared? Or had I been deluding myself all along, seeing warmth where there was only duty, seeing love where there was only obligation? And I thought about Sebastian, poor, innocent Sebastian, who had no idea that his friendship with me would be twisted into something sordid and shameful. I wondered if Alistair had confronted him, if their friendship had been destroyed by the same lie that had destroyed my marriage. I wondered if Sebastian even knew what had happened, or if he was still in London, blissfully unaware that his name was being used to ruin me. But most of all, I thought about the letter. Who had written it? Who had fabricated such a monstrous lie? I could not imagine anyone who hated me enough to do such a thing. I had tried so hard to be kind to everyone, to make friends, to avoid giving offense. I had no enemies, or so I had believed. Clearly, I had been wrong. Dunverin Castle appeared on the 9th morning, rising from the mist like something out of a Gothic novel. It was built of dark stone, its towers crowned with crenellations that spoke of centuries of clan warfare. The main house had been abandoned for 50 years, ever since the 5th Duke had declared it unfit for habitation and moved his family to the more comfortable estate in Edinburgh. What remained was a skeleton of former grandeur, windows dark and empty, gardens overgrown with thorns. The castle sat upon a rocky promontory overlooking a valley that stretched for miles in every direction. Mountains rose on 3 sides, their peaks already dusted with the first snows of winter, and the sky above was a leaden gray that promised more storms to come. There was no village in sight, no sign of human habitation, nothing but rock and heather and the distant cry of ravens circling overhead. But it was not the main house that was to be my prison. Agnes led me around the back of the castle, through a courtyard choked with dead leaves, to a smaller wing that jutted from the eastern wall. This, she informed me, was the widow's tower, built 300 years ago to house the women of the family when they were in mourning, or, as I understood without her saying, when they were in disgrace. The tower was narrow and tall, 4 stories of cramped rooms connected by a spiral staircase that wound upward through the gloom. My apartments consisted of 4 rooms on the uppermost floor. There was a small sitting room with a fireplace that drew poorly, a bedchamber with a 4-poster bed whose curtains smelled of dust and lavender, a tiny dressing room, and a closet that served as a necessary. The furniture was old but well made, the linens clean but worn thin with age. A single window in the bedchamber looked out over the mountains, and on clear days, I could see the silver thread of a river winding through the valley below. Agnes left after a week, returning to Edinburgh with her reports. I was to be attended instead by a local woman named Mrs. Mackenzie, a widow from the village who came each morning to bring me food, clean the grates, and ensure I had not died in the night. She was a silent, weathered woman with hands roughened by decades of hard work, and though she never spoke more than a few words to me, I came to treasure her presence as the only proof that I had not been entirely forgotten by the living world. The first month was the hardest. I wept until I had no tears left, then lay in my bed staring at the water-stained ceiling, trying to understand how my life had come to this. I replayed every conversation I had ever had with Sebastian, searching for the moment when I might have given him cause to hope, to presume, to write whatever lies he had apparently written to my husband. But I could find nothing. Our friendship had been exactly what I believed it to be: innocent, intellectual, utterly without romantic intention. It was not Sebastian who had written that letter. Of this I became increasingly certain as the weeks wore on. Sebastian had been my friend. He had never touched me inappropriately, never spoken words of love, never given any indication that he harbored feelings beyond brotherly affection. Someone else had written that letter, someone who wanted to destroy me, and I had no way of discovering who or why. The loneliness of those early weeks was a physical pain. I had always been surrounded by people, by the bustle of servants and the chatter of acquaintances, by music and conversation and the thousand small interactions that make up a life in society. Now I had nothing but silence and the wind that howled through the gaps in the old stone walls. I began talking to myself simply to hear a human voice. I read the same 3 books I had brought with me until I had memorized entire passages. I walked the perimeter of my apartments, counting my steps, measuring the dimensions of my cage. I watched the seasons change through my single window. Autumn deepened into the russet and gold of late October, then faded into the gray barrenness of November. The first snow fell on All Saints' Day, a light dusting that melted by noon. But I knew from the bite in the air that winter was coming, that soon the mountains would be impassable, that I would be truly and completely alone. There were days when despair threatened to overwhelm me, when the weight of loneliness pressed so heavily upon my chest that I could scarcely breathe. But something within me refused to surrender. Perhaps it was stubbornness, the refusal to give my enemies the satisfaction of seeing me broken. Perhaps it was hope, however faint, that the truth would someday come to light. Or perhaps it was simply the strength I had inherited from my mother, the quiet resilience that had carried her through her own trials before she passed. Whatever it was, I clung to it like a lifeline, determined to endure until circumstances changed. And then, on the night of the winter solstice, something changed. I was sitting by the fire, wrapped in every blanket I could find, when I heard it. A sound like music, faint and far away, rising and falling in a melody I had never heard before. It seemed to come from within the walls themselves, as if the stones were singing. I held my breath, straining to listen, and for a moment the melody grew clearer. A woman's voice, high and sweet, singing words in a language I did not recognize. Then it stopped, and I was left in silence, my heart pounding against my ribs. I told myself I had imagined it. The wind in the chimney, perhaps, or my own loneliness playing tricks on my mind. But the next night, it happened again. And the night after that. Always at the same hour, just as the fire was dying down to embers, I would hear that distant singing, that ghostly lullaby that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The melody was haunting, beautiful, suffused with a melancholy that resonated with my own grief. It sounded like longing given voice, like love that had outlasted death. I found myself waiting for it each night, listening for the first faint strains, feeling a strange comfort in knowing that I was not the only soul to have suffered within these walls. Mrs. Mackenzie noticed the change in me before I said anything. She arrived one morning to find me standing at the window, pale and drawn, and she paused in her work to study my face with those sharp, weathered eyes. "Do you hear them too?" she asked, and her voice was not mocking or dismissive but quiet, almost reverent. I nodded, unable to speak. She set down her basket and crossed the room to stand beside me. "They have been here for as long as anyone can remember," she said. "The ladies of the tower. They were sisters, they say, who loved the same man and were separated by war and pride. One waited here for a sweetheart who never came home. The other died of grief when she learned he had been killed. They have been singing to each other ever since, waiting for someone to help them rest. I wanted to laugh, to dismiss her words as Highland superstition, but I had heard the singing. I had felt, in those first moments of awareness, a presence in the room that was not hostile but curious, as if someone were watching me with gentle interest. "Are they dangerous?" I asked. Mrs. Mackenzie shook her head. "They are lonely," she said. "Like you. They mean no harm. They only want to be remembered." She told me more of their story before she left that day. The sisters had been named Marianne and Elspeth, daughters of a laird who had served under Bonnie Prince Charlie in the Jacobite Rising of 1745. They had both loved a young officer named Kylene, a handsome soldier with a poet's heart and a warrior's courage. Marianne had been betrothed to him, but Elspeth had loved him too in secret, never speaking her feelings aloud. When Kylene rode off to war, Marianne had waited for him in this very tower, watching from this very window for his return. But Kylene never came back. He fell at Culloden, cut down in the bloody slaughter that ended the Jacobite cause forever. Marianne waited for years, refusing to believe he was dead, refusing to abandon hope. And Elspeth, consumed by guilt and grief, had taken her own life rather than watch her sister suffer. The story might have been nothing more than legend, a tale told to frighten children and thrill visitors. But I had heard the singing. I had felt the presence. And I knew, with a certainty that defied rational explanation, that the spirits of Marianne and Elspeth still lingered within these walls. After that conversation, I began to pay attention. I noticed things I had dismissed before as drafts or settling foundations. The way the fire would sometimes flare up without explanation, warming my rooms more thoroughly than the poor chimney should have allowed. The way I would wake to find a blanket that I was certain I had left folded on the chair, now spread carefully over my sleeping form. The way certain corners of my apartments seemed to hold a faint luminescence at dusk, as if lit by candles that were not there. I started speaking to them. It felt foolish at first, addressing empty air, but I was so desperately lonely that even the possibility of invisible company was a comfort. I told them about my life, about my marriage, about the accusation that had sent me here. I told them about Alistair, about the man I had glimpsed beneath his stern exterior, the man I still loved despite everything he had done to me. I told them that I was innocent, that I did not know how to prove it, that I feared I would die in this tower without ever clearing my name. And slowly, incredibly, they began to respond. It started with small things. A book I had been searching for would appear on my pillow, open to a page that seemed to speak directly to my situation. A dried flower would materialize on my windowsill, its petals still fragrant despite the winter cold. Once, I woke to find words traced in the frost on my window, letters that spelled out a name I did not recognize. Marianne. I asked Mrs. Mackenzie about it, and she told me that Marianne had been the elder of the two sisters, the one who had waited in the tower for her lover to return from battle. One evening, as I sat reading by the fire, I felt a gentle pressure on my shoulder, like a hand resting there in comfort. I looked up, expecting to see nothing, and for just an instant I thought I glimpsed a figure standing beside me. A woman in an old-fashioned gown, her face pale but kind, her eyes filled with understanding. She was there for only a heartbeat, less than a second, and then she was gone. But in that moment, I felt something I had not felt in months. I felt that I was not alone. I was not frightened. I should have been, perhaps. I should have been terrified by the evidence of the supernatural, by the proof that spirits walked among us. But the presences in the tower were so gentle, so clearly benevolent, that I could not bring myself to fear them. They were like friends I had never met, companions who understood my suffering because they had suffered the same way themselves. As the weeks passed, I came to feel that I was not alone in my exile. The spirits of Dunvarren, whoever they were, whatever they had been in life, had accepted me as one of their own. They kept me warm when the fire died. They sang me to sleep when the silence became unbearable. They seemed to understand my pain in a way that no living person could, perhaps because they had known similar pain themselves, had loved and lost and waited in vain for reconciliation that never came. I stopped being afraid. I started to feel, for the first time since my banishment, something like peace. The relationship I developed with the spirits was unlike anything I could have imagined. They were not the vengeful ghosts of penny dreadfuls, not the tormented souls seeking release through violence or terror. They were simply two women who had loved deeply and lost everything, and who recognized in me a kindred spirit. They had been waiting for someone who could understand their pain, someone who would not flee in terror or dismiss them as figments of imagination. They had been waiting for someone who needed them as much as they needed to be needed. I began to feel their moods as clearly as I felt my own. There were days when the tower felt heavy with melancholy, when the air itself seemed to press down with the weight of old sorrows. On those days, I would sit by the fire and speak aloud of hope, of the possibility of healing, of the love that endures beyond death. And slowly, the atmosphere would lighten, as if my words were medicine for wounds that had never fully closed. There were other days when the spirits seemed almost playful. I would find my hairbrush moved from one table to another, my book turned to a different page than where I had left it. Once, I discovered my warmest shawl draped over the back of my chair in the sitting room, though I was certain I had left it in the bedchamber. These small interactions delighted me, proof that I was not imagining the presences that shared my exile. I learned to read the signs of their communication. A cold spot in the corner of the room meant that Elspeth, the younger sister, was nearby. She was the more timid of the two, hovering at the edges of my awareness, watching but rarely approaching. The singing was always Marianne, the elder, whose voice had once been famous throughout the Highlands for its purity and range. Mrs. Mackenzie told me that Marianne had been a great beauty in her day, courted by lords and lairds throughout Scotland. But she had given her heart to Caeleen alone, a young man of modest birth but noble character. Their love story became my comfort in those long winter nights. I would ask Mrs. Mackenzie to tell me more each time she visited, piecing together the fragments of their lives like a mosaic. Caeleen had been a poet as well as a soldier, composing verses in Gaelic that were still sung in the villages below. Marianne had kept his letters in a carved wooden box, reading them by candlelight every night until the paper wore thin from handling. When word came that he had fallen at Culloden, she had taken to her bed and refused food for 3 days, and it was only her father's threats of forced feeding that had brought her back to the table. Elspeth's role in the tragedy was more complex. She had loved Caeleen too, but silently, never speaking her feelings aloud, believing that her devotion to her sister must take precedence over her own heart. She had watched Marianne and Caeleen together, had witnessed their stolen kisses and whispered promises, and she had hidden her own pain beneath a mask of sisterly affection. When Caeleen died, Elspeth had mourned him as deeply as Marianne, but she could not share her grief with anyone. To do so would have been to confess a love that honor forbade. The guilt had consumed her. She blamed herself for not warning Marianne of the danger, for not finding some way to keep Caeleen from riding off to war. She blamed herself for the secret joy she had felt when Marianne's engagement was announced, that shameful moment of gladness that someone else would have to endure the pain of losing him. The weight of her unspoken grief, combined with the harsh Highland winter, proved too much for her fragile constitution. She fell ill with a fever that January and never recovered, slipping away in her sleep while Marianne held her hand. Marianne had never recovered from the double loss. She spent the rest of her life in the widow's tower, refusing to leave, refusing to marry, refusing to accept that either her lover or her sister were truly gone. She died at the age of 43, still waiting, still hoping, still listening for footsteps on the stair that never came. It was a tragedy worthy of Shakespeare, and I wept when Mrs. Mackenzie finished telling it. But I also understood for the first time why the spirits had taken such an interest in me. They saw in my situation an echo of their own story. A woman accused falsely, exiled unjustly, waiting in this tower for a reconciliation that might never come. They wanted to help me avoid their fate. They wanted to ensure that my story would have a different ending. I developed a routine in those long winter weeks, a structure to my days that kept despair at bay. I rose with the dawn, such as it was in those short northern days, and performed my ablutions in water that was often half frozen, despite Mrs. Mackenzie's efforts to keep the fire going. I breakfasted on the simple fare she brought me, porridge and bread, and sometimes a boiled egg, then spent the morning reading or writing in my journal. The afternoons I devoted to walking, pacing the perimeter of my rooms like a caged tiger, or sometimes descending the spiral staircase to explore the lower floors of the tower. I found rooms that had not been opened in decades, their furniture shrouded in white cloths, their windows dark with grime. I found a small library on the second floor, its shelves lined with books in Latin and French and Gaelic, and I spent many happy hours there, discovering volumes that had not been touched in a century. And in the evenings, as the darkness gathered and the fire burned low, I would sit by the window and listen for the singing. It came almost every night now, sometimes faint and sometimes clear, sometimes a single voice and sometimes two, harmonizing in a melody that made my heart ache with its beauty. I came to think of it as my lullaby, my nightly reminder that I was being watched over, that the spirits of the tower had taken me under their protection. The winter deepened. Snow fell in great white curtains, blanketing the mountains and filling the valley until the world outside my window was nothing but an endless expanse of white. Mrs. Mackenzie came less frequently, battling through drifts that reached her waist, bringing me stores of food that she urged me to ration carefully. There was talk in the village of the worst winter in living memory, of roads impassable and livestock frozen in the fields. We might be cut off for months, she warned me. I needed to prepare for the possibility that I would be truly alone. But I was not afraid. The spirits of the tower would keep me company. They had shown me, in their gentle way, that solitude was not the same as abandonment. I had my books, my thoughts, and the strange comfort of knowing that even in this forgotten corner of the world, I was being watched over by presences that wished me well. The days blurred together, one much like another, marked only by the slow deepening of the snow and the gradual shortening and then lengthening of the days. I lost track of time, forgot what day of the week it was, stopped caring about the passage of hours and minutes. I existed in a kind of suspended animation, neither living nor dying, simply enduring. And then, one night, everything changed. It was on the 23rd night of the great blizzard that everything changed. I was sitting by the fire, wrapped in blankets, reading by the light of my last candle, when I heard a sound that was not the wind or the singing of the spirits. It was a pounding, desperate and irregular, coming from somewhere below my apartments. Someone was at the outer door of the tower. I seized a poker from the hearth and made my way down the narrow staircase, my heart racing. No one came to the widow's tower. No one even knew I was here, except for Mrs. Mackenzie and the servants in Edinburgh who had been sworn to secrecy. Whoever was at that door had either lost their way in the storm or come with some darker purpose. The staircase was treacherous in the darkness, the stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use. I descended slowly, one hand on the wall to steady myself, the poker clutched in the other. The pounding had grown weaker as I approached, and by the time I reached the ground floor, it had stopped entirely. The silence that followed was more unnerving than the pounding had been. I stood in the darkness of the entrance hall, my breath misting in the cold air, straining to hear any sound from beyond the heavy oak door. The wind had not abated, still howling around the corners of the tower, driving snow against the ancient stones with a sound like sand thrown against glass. But beneath the wind, there was nothing. No voice calling for help. No movement on the other side. I thought of the spirits above me, of Marianne and Elspeth who had watched over me these many weeks. Were they watching now? Did they know who stood on the other side of that door? I wished I could ask them, wished I could receive some sign of guidance, but the tower was silent, waiting. Perhaps whoever had been there had given up, had stumbled back into the storm to seek shelter elsewhere. Perhaps it had been no one at all, just a branch torn from a tree and thrown against the door by the wind. Perhaps I had imagined the whole thing, my lonely mind conjuring visitors out of nothing. But something made me lift the heavy bar, something made me pull the door open against the weight of the accumulated snow. Later, I would wonder if it was my own compassion that moved me, or if the spirits had somehow guided my hand. But in that moment, I did not think at all. I simply acted. A man lay crumpled on the threshold, half buried in white. He was wrapped in a greatcoat that had frozen stiff, his face hidden beneath a layer of ice and frost. I thought at first that he was dead, but when I knelt beside him, I saw his lips move, forming words too faint to hear. He was alive, barely, clinging to consciousness by the thinnest thread. I could not leave him there to die. Whatever sins he might have committed, whatever danger he might represent, I could not close the door on a living soul and return to my fire, knowing that I had condemned him to freeze to death on my doorstep. I took hold of his arms and dragged him inside, inch by agonizing inch, until he lay on the stone floor of the entrance hall, still as death but breathing. The exertion left me gasping, my arms trembling with strain. The man was heavy, his limbs stiff with cold, and every inch of progress had required more strength than I thought I possessed. I closed and barred the door against the storm, then knelt beside him again, trying to assess his condition. His clothes were fine, I noticed. The greatcoat made of expensive wool, the boots beneath it crafted from good leather. Not a vagrant then, not a wanderer who had lost his way. Someone with means, someone who had business in this remote corner of Scotland. But who would venture out in such a storm? And why? I brushed the ice from his face, working carefully to clear his features without harming the frozen skin beneath. Dark hair plastered to his forehead, strong jaw, rigid with cold, closed eyes beneath brows that were dusted with frost. And then I recognized him. Alistair, my husband. The man who had cast me out without a hearing, who had refused to listen to my protestations of innocence, who had sent me to this frozen wilderness to rot in silence and shame. He lay before me now, helpless and dying, delivered by some cruel twist of fate to the mercy of the woman he had wronged. I sat back on my heels, my hands trembling, my mind racing. 1,000 thoughts crowded my brain, each more confused than the last. How had he come here? Why would he brave such a storm to reach a place he had sworn never to visit? Was this some trick, some test, some final punishment designed to break what remained of my spirit? But he was so cold, so still. Whatever his reasons for coming, he would not survive the night without help. I knelt there for a long moment, paralyzed by indecision. Part of me wanted to leave him where he lay, to walk back up those stairs and let nature take its course. He had destroyed my life, my reputation, my happiness. He had cast me out without even the courtesy of a hearing, had believed the worst of me on the strength of a single letter. He deserved whatever fate had brought him to my doorstep. But I could not do it. I could not become the monster he had believed me to be. I could not let his cruelty transform me into someone cruel in turn. I made my decision. I could not let him die. Not because I had forgiven him, not because I believed he deserved my compassion, but because to watch him perish when I had the power to save him would have made me into something I was not. I would not become bitter. I would not become cruel. I would not let his treatment of me transform me into a woman who could stand by while another human being suffered. Getting him up the stairs was the hardest thing I have ever done. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and heavily built, and I was a woman weakened by months of poor food and little exercise. I pulled and pushed and cajoled his unconscious body up each step, stopping to rest every few seconds, my muscles screaming in protest. The spirits seemed to help, or perhaps I only imagined it, but there were moments when he felt lighter than he should have, when some invisible force seemed to be lifting from the other side. It took the better part of an hour to get him up 3 flights of stairs. By the time I dragged him into my sitting room and laid him before the fire, I was drenched in sweat despite the cold, my arms and legs shaking with exhaustion. But I could not rest. There was too much to be done. I stripped off his frozen coat and boots, wrapping him in every blanket I possessed. His skin was the color of wax, his lips blue, and when I pressed my ear to his chest, his heartbeat was so faint I could barely hear it. I did not know if he would live. I did not know if anything I could do would be enough to save him from the cold that had seeped into his bones, but I tried. I heated water on the fire and pressed warm cloths to his hands and feet. I chafed his fingers and toes, trying to restore circulation, trying to coax warmth back into his frozen extremities. I lay beside him, sharing the heat of my body, refusing to let him slip away into the darkness. I talked to him, though I do not know if he could hear me, telling him that he could not die. Not yet. Not before I had a chance to make him understand. I told him about the spirits, about the months of loneliness, about the innocence I had never been able to prove. I told him that despite everything, despite the cruelty and the injustice and the breaking of my heart, I still loved him. I had never stopped loving him, and I would not let him go until he knew the truth. The hours passed slowly, measured only by the guttering of the candle and the gradual lightening of the sky beyond the window. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound, checking his pulse and his breathing, adjusting the blankets, adding fuel to the fire. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind shrieking around the tower like a chorus of damned souls. But within my small circle of firelight, we were safe. Sometime in the darkest hours of the night, I felt a presence in the room. Not threatening, not hostile, but watchful. I looked up and saw them clearly for the first time, 2 women standing in the shadows by the door. They were translucent, their features indistinct, but I could see that they were young, that they wore gowns from another century, that their faces held expressions of profound sadness. Marianne and Elspeth, the sisters of the tower, they did not speak, they did not move. They simply watched, their ghostly eyes fixed on the man who lay unconscious before the fire. And though I could not hear their voices, I felt their message as clearly as if they had spoken aloud. Save him. Forgive him. Do not make the mistake we made. I nodded, acknowledging their presence, accepting their counsel. And as I watched, they faded slowly from view, dissolving into the shadows like mist before the morning sun. He woke sometime before dawn. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening as consciousness returned. He looked at me with an expression of such bewilderment that I might have laughed if the situation had not been so grave. He tried to speak, but his voice came out as a croak, his throat too parched to form words. I gave him water, holding the cup to his lips, watching as he drank in small, careful sips. When he had finished, he lay back against the pillows I had arranged behind his head and studied my face with an intensity that made me want to look away. "Cordelia," he said at last, and my name in his mouth was like a key turning in a lock, opening doors I had thought sealed forever. "You are at Dunverin," I told him. "You nearly died in the storm." He closed his eyes, and I saw the muscles of his jaw tighten as if he were fighting some internal battle. "I came to find you," he said. "I had to tell you." "Tell me what?" "That I was wrong." His voice broke on the word, and when he opened his eyes again, there were tears glistening on his lashes. "I was so wrong, Cordelia. I believed a lie, and I destroyed everything that mattered, because I was too proud and too wounded to listen. I did not know what to say. I had dreamed of this moment, had imagined him on his knees before me, begging forgiveness, admitting that he had misjudged me. But now that it was happening, now that he lay weak and broken before me, I felt no triumph. Only a vast, hollow sadness. "Who wrote the letter?" I asked, though I was not sure I wanted to know. Alistair's face contorted with pain. "My sister-in-law," he said. "Marguerite, Lady Marguerite Drummond, his elder brother's widow, a woman I had always found cold and unwelcoming, but never suspected of active malice. Why would she do such a thing?" "Because she hated you," Alistair said. "Because she wanted to be the one to manage my household, to control my affairs. Because she believed that if I cast you out, I would turn to her for comfort and guidance. She forged the letter. She invented the whole affair. And I believed her, because believing her was easier than trusting my own heart. How did you discover the truth?" He reached into the inner pocket of his waistcoat, which I had left on him for warmth, and drew out a folded paper. "A letter," he said. "From Sebastian. He wrote to me from Italy, where he has been these past months. He heard rumors of your banishment and demanded to know what had happened. When I told him the accusation, he was horrified. He swore on his honor that he had never touched you, never presumed to hope, never felt anything but brotherly affection. He told me that he had confided in Marguerite about his friendship with you, about the books he had lent you and the conversations you had shared. He thought nothing of it. He did not know she would use his confidence to destroy you." I took the letter from his trembling hand and read it by the firelight. The paper was crumpled and water-stained, as if it had been read many times and carried for many miles. Sebastian's words were passionate, eloquent, filled with righteous anger on my behalf. He demanded that Alistair make amends, that he bring me home, that he acknowledge publicly that I had been falsely accused. He offered to return to England immediately if his testimony would help clear my name. I read the letter twice, then a third time, letting each word sink in. Sebastian had defended me. Sebastian had believed in my innocence. And his defense had finally broken through the wall of mistrust that Alistair had built around his heart. When I finished reading, I looked at my husband, and I saw in his face a man who had been broken by his own mistakes. The proud, reserved Duke of Dunveran was gone, replaced by someone humbler, more human, more capable of feeling. He looked at me as if I were the sun, and he had been wandering for months in darkness. "I confronted Marguerite," he said. "She denied it at first, but when I showed her Sebastian's letter, she confessed everything. She has been sent away, Cordelia. She will never trouble us again." I set the letter aside and sat back, trying to absorb the magnitude of what I had just learned. My exile, my suffering, the destruction of my reputation and my happiness had all been the work of a jealous woman who saw me as an obstacle to her own ambitions. And my husband, the man who should have protected me, had believed her lies because he was too wounded by imagined betrayal to see the truth standing right before him. "Why did you come yourself?" I asked. "You could have sent a letter. You could have sent a servant to bring me home." Alistair pushed himself up on his elbows, wincing at the effort. "Because I needed to see you," he said. "I needed to tell you myself how wrong I was. I needed to look into your eyes and beg for a forgiveness I do not deserve. And if I cannot give it?" He was silent for a long moment. "Then I will have at least tried," he said. "I will have at least done one honorable thing in this whole wretched affair." I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow that was still falling, lighter now but persistent. The world beyond my prison had shrunk to a few feet of white, and within this tiny space, the whole course of my future was being decided. I could refuse him. I could nurse him back to health and send him away, demanding a formal separation, a settlement that would allow me to live independently. I could cling to my righteous anger and spend the rest of my life as a wounded party, a woman wronged, a symbol of male injustice. But that was not who I wanted to be. I thought of Marianne and Elspeth, the sisters who had haunted this tower for over a century. They had been trapped by their own grief, their own inability to let go, their own refusal to forgive. They had spent 100 years singing to each other in the darkness, bound to this place by loves they could not release. I did not want that to be my fate. I did not want to spend the rest of my life defined by the wrongs that had been done to me. I turned back to face him. "Do you love me?" I asked. Not as a duty, not as an arrangement. "Do you truly love me, Alistair?" His answer came without hesitation. "I have loved you since the day we met," he said. "I loved you when I believed you had betrayed me. I loved you through every miserable month of separation, hating myself for the pain I had caused. I love you now more than I have ever loved anything in my life, and I will spend every remaining day proving it to you if you will only give me the chance." I believed him. Perhaps I was foolish to believe so easily, to forgive so quickly what months of suffering should have made unforgivable. But I had learned something in my exile, something the spirits had taught me through their gentle presence and their mournful songs. I had learned that holding on to anger was its own kind of prison, that refusing to forgive was a way of keeping oneself trapped in the past. The sisters who haunted this tower had spent centuries waiting, unable to move forward, bound by loves they could not release. I did not want that to be my fate. I crossed the room and knelt beside him, taking his cold hand in mine. "I forgive you," I said. And the words felt like a door opening, like sunlight breaking through clouds. "But you must promise me something in return. Anything. You must promise never to doubt me again. Whatever trials we face, whatever whispers reach your ears, you must come to me first. You must trust me, Alistair. Without trust, there is no love. I promise," he said, and his voice was steadier now, firmer. "On my honor and my name and everything I hold sacred." I leaned forward and kissed his forehead, gently, as one might kiss a child after a nightmare. "Then rest," I told him. "You are still very weak. We will talk more when you have recovered." He nodded, his eyes already heavy with exhaustion. But before he drifted back to sleep, he caught my hand and held it against his chest, over the place where his heart beat slowly but steadily. "Thank you," he whispered, "for saving me, for not letting me die on your doorstep as I deserved." I said nothing, only held his hand as he slept, feeling the warmth return gradually to his fingers, watching the color seep back into his face. The fire crackled in the grate, and somewhere in the walls of the old tower, I heard the spirits singing, their voices lighter now, almost joyful, as if they too were pleased by what had passed between us. The storm continued for 3 more days. We were truly snowbound, cut off from the world by drifts that reached the first-floor windows. And in that time of forced intimacy, something shifted between Alistair and me. The barriers that had always separated us, the reserve and formality that characterized our marriage, began to crumble. He talked to me as he had never talked before. He told me about his childhood, about the father who had been cold and demanding, about the older brother whose death had thrust Alistair into a role he never wanted. He told me about his fears, his doubts, his desperate desire to be worthy of a title that felt like a weight around his neck. He told me that he had believed Marguerite's lies so readily because part of him had always feared that a woman as vibrant and intelligent as I was could never truly love someone as closed off as himself. I told him about my own fears, about the mother I barely remembered who had died when I was young, about the years of governesses and etiquette lessons, of being shaped into a proper lady, while the real Cordelia, the curious, questioning, passionate woman inside, was pushed further and further into hiding. I told him that his reserve had hurt me, that I had often wondered if he regretted our marriage, if he wished he had chosen someone more docile and less inclined to form her own opinions. We talked for hours, discovering each other anew, and with each confession, each revelation, I felt the foundation of something stronger being laid. Not the careful, cautious marriage we had known before, built on obligation and propriety, but something real and lasting, built on truth. We shared meals together, simple fare from the stores Mrs. Mackenzie had left, eaten before the fire, like peasants rather than aristocrats. We played chess with an ancient set I had found in the library, and I learned that Alistair was a surprisingly poor loser, sulking for nearly an hour after I checkmated him for the third time. We read aloud to each other from the books I had discovered in the tower, volumes of poetry and philosophy that sparked debates lasting well into the night. There were difficult moments, too. Times when the old hurts rose to the surface, when I found myself unable to look at him without remembering the cold finality of his judgment, the way he had turned his back on me without allowing me to speak. He saw these moments in my face, and to his credit, he did not try to minimize them or rush me past them. He simply waited, patient and penitent, until the wave of pain subsided and I was ready to continue. We spoke of Marguerite, of her machinations and her motives. Alistair told me things he had never shared before, about the years she had spent as the unofficial mistress of his household, about the subtle ways she had worked to keep him isolated and dependent on her guidance. He had not seen it at the time, had not recognized the web she was weaving around him. Looking back, he could trace the pattern clearly, could see how she had positioned herself as indispensable, how she had discouraged him from forming close relationships with anyone who might challenge her influence. I asked him why he had believed her so readily, why he had not questioned the accusation even for a moment. His answer was painful to hear, but helped me understand what had happened in his heart. "Because I was afraid," he admitted. "From the moment I met you, I was afraid that you would discover what a hollow, broken man I truly am. I was afraid that you would see through the facade of the Duke and find only emptiness beneath." When Marguerite showed me that letter, when she told me that you had found comfort in another man's arms, part of me was horrified. But another part, a darker part, was almost relieved. It confirmed what I had always believed, that I was not worthy of being loved, that anyone who seemed to love me was either deceiving me or deceiving herself. It was a confession that cost him dearly to make. I could see the shame burning in his eyes, the self-loathing that had festered beneath his proud exterior for so many years. And in that moment, I understood something I had not understood before. His coldness, his reserve, the walls he had built around his heart. They were not signs of indifference, but of fear. He had been protecting himself from the pain of rejection, never realizing that in doing so, he was making rejection inevitable. I took his hand in mine and held it tightly. "You are not hollow," I told him. "You are not empty. You are wounded, as I am wounded, as everyone is wounded who dares to love in a world that offers no guarantees. But wounds can heal, Alistair. We are proof of that." He brought my hand to his lips and kissed it, and I felt the tremor that ran through him at the touch. "I do not deserve you," he said. "I will never deserve you, but I will spend every day of my life trying." And we touched, carefully at first, then with growing familiarity. He would take my hand as we sat before the fire. I would lean my head against his shoulder as he read. Small intimacies, innocent in themselves, but charged with meaning after months of separation and years of reserve. We were learning each other again, or perhaps for the first time, and every discovery felt like a gift. On the fourth night, the storm finally broke. We stood together at the window of my sitting room, watching the clouds part to reveal a sky brilliant with stars. The snow lay deep and untouched below us, glittering like diamonds in the moonlight, and for a moment the world seemed new, washed clean, full of possibility. "We should leave soon," Alistair said. "As soon as the roads are passable. I want to take you home, Cordelia. Our real home. I want to begin again." I nodded, but something made me turn back to look at the room behind us. The fire was burning low, the shadows deepening in the corners, and I thought I saw, just for an instant, two figures standing by the door. Two women in old-fashioned gowns, their faces pale but peaceful, watching us with expressions of quiet satisfaction. "Do you see them?" I whispered. Alistair followed my gaze, And though I do not know what he saw, his hand tightened on mine. "This place is not just a ruin," he said slowly. "There is something here. Something that wanted us to find each other." "They kept me warm," I said. "When I thought I had been forgotten by everyone in the world, they reminded me that I was not alone." We stood in silence, honoring the presences that had watched over me through my exile. And when I looked again, the figures were gone. But the air felt different, lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. The spirits of Dunvarin had completed their task. They had brought a lost wife and her broken husband together, had witnessed their reconciliation, and now they could rest. Mrs. Mackenzie came the next morning, battling through the deep snow with provisions and news. She found me and Alistair together in the sitting room, drinking tea like any ordinary married couple, and the look on her face when she recognized the Duke was something I will never forget. A mixture of shock and satisfaction, as if she had known all along that something like this would happen. "The spirits will be pleased," she said, and she smiled at us with something like approval. We left Dunvarin Castle 3 days later, when the roads had been cleared enough for the carriage that Alistair had left in the village to make its way up the mountain. I looked back only once as we drove away, watching the widow's tower grow smaller in the distance, its dark stone stark against the white of the snow. I thought I saw a light in the uppermost window, a warm glow like candlelight, and I fancied that Marianne and Elspeth were standing there, watching us go, wishing us well on our journey. "Thank you," I whispered, though I knew they could not hear me. "Thank you for everything." The journey home was long but not unpleasant. The snow had packed into a hard crust that the horses could traverse, and though progress was slow, we were together, wrapped in furs in the back of the carriage, talking and laughing and sometimes sitting in comfortable silence. Alistair had sent word ahead, announcing our return and demanding that the household be prepared to receive its mistress with all the honor she deserved. He was determined, he told me, to make a public spectacle of my reinstatement, to ensure that everyone who had whispered about my disgrace would know that I had been innocent all along. I appreciated his intentions, though I confess the thought of facing society again filled me with anxiety. I had been away for nearly 6 months. I had no idea what rumors had circulated in my absence, what conclusions people had drawn, what reception I would receive. Part of me wanted nothing more than to retreat to a quiet country estate and live out my days far from the scrutiny of London. But Alistair would not hear of it. "You have nothing to be ashamed of," he told me firmly. "The shame belongs to those who wronged you, and I intend to make sure they bear it." We arrived in Edinburgh first, to the grand townhouse where we had spent the early months of our marriage. The servants lined up in the entrance hall to greet us, and I saw surprise and confusion on their faces as Alistair led me inside with my hand on his arm, treating me with a deference that bordered on reverence. He announced, in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall, that the Duchess had been the victim of a cruel deception, that her accuser had confessed and been banished, and that anyone who spoke ill of Lady Cordelia in his hearing would face his personal displeasure. The household absorbed this information in stunned silence. I saw the housekeeper, Mrs. Campbell, press her hand to her heart, and I thought I detected tears in her eyes. She had always been kind to me, in the quiet way of servants who cannot openly take sides, but who find small ways to show their sympathies. Now she curtsied deeply and welcomed me home with a warmth that touched me more than I could say. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Letters had to be written, announcements made, a whole campaign of social rehabilitation undertaken. Alistair threw himself into the task with an energy I had never seen in him before, as if he were trying to atone through sheer effort for the wrong he had done. He invited friends to dine with us, ensuring that they saw us together, that they witnessed our renewed affection. He escorted me to concerts and exhibitions, always keeping me at his side, always ready to defend my honor against the slightest hint of doubt. And slowly, the tide of opinion began to turn. The whispers that had followed my exile gave way to new whispers, about the jealous sister-in-law who had been exposed, about the Duke who had nearly destroyed his marriage through misplaced trust, about the steadfast wife who had forgiven him despite everything. I became, in the eyes of society, something of a romantic figure, the wrongfully accused heroine who had triumphed over adversity, the woman whose virtue had been vindicated by time and truth. I did not seek this attention, but I accepted it with as much grace as I could muster. It was Alistair's gift to me, this restoration of my reputation, and I would not diminish it by false modesty. I held my head high and met the gazes of those who had once avoided me, and if there was satisfaction in seeing them look away first, I tried not to dwell on it. There were those who doubted, of course. There always are. The gossips who had feasted on my disgrace were reluctant to abandon a story that had provided such delicious entertainment. They whispered that Marguerite had been made a scapegoat, that the Duke was simply tired of his exile and had concocted a convenient explanation for his change of heart. They whispered that I had bewitched him somehow, that I had used feminine wiles to convince him of my innocence. They whispered all manner of malicious nonsense, as people will when the truth is less interesting than fiction. But their whispers grew quieter as the weeks passed, as they saw the genuine devotion in Alistair's manner, as they witnessed the tenderness between us that could not be feigned. Even the most hardened skeptics had to admit that whatever had happened in that remote Highland castle, it had transformed the Duke of Dunvarren into a different man. The cold, distant aristocrat they had known was gone, replaced by someone warmer, more human, more obviously in love. And when Sebastian returned and added his voice to my defense, even the last holdouts were silenced. Lord Sebastian Hale was known throughout society as a man of impeccable honor, whose word was as good as a sworn oath. When he stated publicly that he had never been anything but a friend to the Duchess, that the accusations against her were entirely fabricated, no one dared to contradict him. My father came to Edinburgh within a fortnight of our return, having received Alistair's letter explaining everything that had happened. I wept when I saw him, this dignified old man who had aged 10 years in my absence, and he held me in his arms as he had not done since I was a small child. He told me that he had never believed the rumors, that he had written to Alistair repeatedly demanding to see me, that he had been refused each time. He told me that he had nearly challenged the Duke to a duel, and only my sister's pleading had prevented him from doing something that would have gotten him killed or imprisoned. I introduced my father to the man who had wronged me and then repented, the man who had destroyed my life and then rebuilt it. The two of them regarded each other warily at first, my father's anger barely contained, Alistair's shame evident in every line of his body. But as they talked, as Alistair explained and apologized and vowed to spend the rest of his life making amends, I saw my father's hostility slowly give way to something like grudging respect. "He loves you," my father said to me later, when we had a moment alone. "I did not think him capable of such feeling, but I see now that I was wrong. He loves you, and he is broken by what he did. I cannot forgive him entirely, not yet. But I can see that you have forgiven him, and that must be enough for now." I squeezed his hand, grateful beyond words for his understanding. "He is trying," I said, "and I believe that is all any of us can do." Spring came early that year, melting the snow that had locked Scotland in its grip, bringing green shoots pushing through the dark earth. Alistair suggested that we spend the season at his favorite estate, a beautiful property in the borders called Thornhaven, where the gardens were famous for their roses, and the library was one of the finest in the country. I agreed eagerly, grateful for the chance to escape the social whirl of Edinburgh and begin building the life we had been denied. Thornhaven was everything I had imagined and more. The house was elegant without being ostentatious, filled with light and warmth and the scent of flowers. The grounds stretched for miles, encompassing formal gardens, wild meadows, and a small lake where swans glided serenely across the water. I fell in love with it immediately, and I think Alistair fell in love with it again through my eyes. seeing his childhood home anew through the wonder of someone encountering it for the first time. We settled into a routine of quiet contentment. Mornings were for correspondence and estate business, which Alistair began teaching me to help with, treating my opinions and suggestions with the same seriousness he would give any trusted advisor. I discovered that I had a talent for the work, a facility with numbers and planning that surprised us both. Within a few months, I was managing the household accounts entirely, and Alistair had begun consulting me on matters of tenant welfare and land improvement. It gave me a sense of purpose that I had never known before. In my previous life, as a young lady of good breeding, I had been trained for nothing more than decorative existence. I could play the pianoforte, speak French, embroider cushions, and make polite conversation at dinner parties. These accomplishments, which had once seemed so important, now revealed themselves as the hollow achievements they had always been. At Thornhaven, I was learning to be useful, to contribute something of real value to the life we were building together. Alistair encouraged my involvement in every aspect of estate management. He took me to meet the tenants, introducing me not as the Duchess, but as his partner, someone whose opinions mattered as much as his own. He showed me the innovative farming techniques he was implementing, the new machinery he had ordered from England, the plans he had drawn up for improving the workers' cottages. He treated me as an equal, a collaborator, and in doing so, he gave me back the sense of self-worth that his earlier cruelty had nearly destroyed. The estate workers accepted me with a warmth that surprised me, given the rumors that must have reached even this remote corner of Scotland. But Mrs. Campbell had done her work well, spreading the true story of my exile and vindication among the staff, and they in turn had shared it with their families in the village. By the time I arrived at Thornhaven, I was already something of a local heroine, the wrongfully accused wife who had forgiven her husband and been restored to her rightful place. The women especially seemed to admire me, nodding respectfully when we passed on the estate roads, their eyes full of a sympathy that needed no words. Afternoons were for walks through the gardens or rides across the moors, side by side on horseback, exploring the land that would one day belong to our heirs. Evenings were for reading aloud to each other, for music in the drawing room, for long conversations that stretched into the night. And at the center of it all was the growing certainty that we loved each other. Not the cautious, conditional love of our early marriage, but something deeper and more durable. We had both been through fire, had both been tested and found wanting, and had both chosen to begin again. That shared struggle created a bond between us that nothing could break. One evening in late April, as we sat together in the library watching the sun set over the lake, Alistair took my hand and told me that there was something he had been wanting to say. He looked nervous, almost shy, which was so unlike him that I felt a flutter of anxiety in my chest. "What is it?" I asked. He was silent for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "When we married," he began, "I thought I knew what our life would be. A suitable match, a comfortable arrangement, perhaps eventually some affection. I did not expect to feel what I feel now. I did not know I was capable of it. And what do you feel now?" He turned to face me, his expression more open than I had ever seen it. "I feel as if I have been sleeping all my life," he said, "and you have finally woken me. I feel as if every moment apart from you is a moment wasted, and every moment with you is a gift I do not deserve. I feel as if I would do anything, sacrifice anything, to make you happy." I reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw, the planes of his cheekbones. "You do make me happy," I told him. "You make me happier than I ever thought possible." He kissed me then, gently at first, then with growing passion, and I felt something inside me unlock and expand, making room for a joy I had almost given up hoping for. The past fell away, the months of exile and loneliness and pain, and there was only this moment, this man, this love that had been tested and proven true. We spoke later that night of the future, of the family we hoped to have, the life we wanted to build, the legacy we would leave behind. Alistair told me that he wanted to restore Dunverin Castle, not as a prison for unwanted wives, but as a memorial to those who had suffered there. He wanted to honor the spirits who had watched over me, to ensure that their story was remembered. I agreed wholeheartedly, moved by his desire to make something beautiful out of what had been a place of sorrow. And we spoke of Sebastian, who had written again to express his joy at our reconciliation. He planned to return to England in the autumn, and Alistair wanted to welcome him back, to rebuild the friendship that Marguerite's lies had nearly destroyed. I supported this too, knowing that forgiveness had to extend in all directions if we were truly to be free of the past. The summer of that year was the happiest of my life. Thornhaven bloomed around us, roses and lavender and honeysuckle filling the air with fragrance. We entertained friends and family, including my father and sister, who wept with relief when they saw me safe and restored. We rode out to picnic by the lake, attended summer festivals in the nearby village, and spent long, drowsy afternoons in the library, reading side by side in companionable silence. Sebastian arrived in September, thinner and more thoughtful than when I had last seen him, his travels having given him a gravity that suited him well. He embraced Alistair like a brother, tears streaming down his face, and then he turned to me and bowed deeply, his voice thick with emotion as he apologized for the unwitting role he had played in my suffering. I told him there was nothing to forgive. He had been as much a victim of Marguerite's scheme as I had. His friendship twisted into something ugly by a woman he had trusted. We three sat together in the drawing room that evening, talking until the fire burned low, and by the time we retired for the night, I felt that something precious had been restored, a circle of trust and affection that Marguerite had tried, but ultimately failed to break. I began to notice as the months passed, subtle changes in myself, a new roundness to my figure, a tenderness in places that had never been tender before, a strange aversion to certain foods and a craving for others. I said nothing to Alistair at first, wanting to be certain, but when the evidence became undeniable, I shared my suspicion with the local midwife, who confirmed what I had begun to hope. I was with child. I told Alistair on a warm evening in late October, as we sat on a bench overlooking the lake, watching the last light of day fade from the sky. The trees were ablaze with autumn color, red and gold and orange, and the air was crisp with the promise of coming winter. He did not speak at first. He simply took my hand in both of his and held it, his head bowed, his shoulders trembling. When he looked up at last, there were tears streaming down his face. "I do not deserve this," he said. "After everything I have done, I do not deserve such happiness." I pulled him close, letting him weep against my shoulder as I stroked his hair. "Perhaps none of us deserve the good things that come to us," I said softly. "Perhaps that is what grace means. We receive what we have not earned, and we try to be worthy of it." He lifted his head and kissed me, tasting of salt and joy. "I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy," he promised. The months that followed were full of preparation and anticipation. Alistair hired the best physicians from Edinburgh and London, ensured that I had everything I could possibly need for my comfort and health. He fussed over me constantly, which I found alternately touching and exasperating, and I had to remind him more than once that women had been having babies for thousands of years without their husbands hovering over them like anxious hens. But I understood his fear. He had come so close to losing me, to losing everything that now gave his life meaning. The thought of anything going wrong, of any shadow falling over our happiness, was almost more than he could bear. Winter came again, gentler this year than the last, but still bringing snow and ice and long dark evenings by the fire. I grew larger and more uncomfortable, my movements restricted by my swelling body, my nights interrupted by the restless stirring of the life within me. But I was not unhappy. I was filled with a peace I had never known before, a sense that I was exactly where I was meant to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The baby came on a snowy night in February, exactly 1 year after the storm that had driven Alistair to Dunverin Castle. The birth was difficult, but not dangerous, and when it was over, I held in my arms a healthy, squalling infant with his father's dark hair and my own gray eyes. A son, an heir to the dukedom, but more than that, a symbol of everything we had survived and built together. A future we had earned through suffering and forgiveness and love. Alistair wept again when he held his son for the first time. He made no attempt to hide his tears, this man who had once been too proud to show any emotion at all. He cradled the baby as if he were the most precious thing in the world, which of course he was, and when he looked at me, his eyes were full of a wonder that took my breath away. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything, for giving me a chance to become the man I should have been." I reached out to touch his face, tracing the paths of his tears. "We saved each other," I said. "That is what love is supposed to do." We named the boy James, after my father, and Alistair, after his own. He grew quickly, as babies do, and soon our quiet household was filled with the sounds of laughter and mischief and all the chaos that comes with raising a spirited young man. We had more family in the years that followed, filling Thornhaven with noise and life and love. But I never forgot those months in the widow's tower, nor the spirits who had kept me company when I had no one else. We restored Dunverin Castle as Alistair had promised, transforming it from a ruin into a beautiful retreat where families could gather in summer to enjoy the wild beauty of the Highlands. We told our family the story of the sisters who had haunted the tower, and every year on the winter solstice, we lit candles in their memory, honoring their love and their sacrifice. I returned to the tower once, many years later, on a clear summer day when the mountains were green and the sky was a brilliant blue. I climbed the spiral staircase to the room where I had spent those lonely months, and I stood by the window looking out over the valley that had been my only view of the world. The room was different now, bright and airy, the old furniture replaced with comfortable modern pieces. But something of the old atmosphere remained, a sense of presence, a feeling of being watched. I spoke to them one last time, to Marianne and Elspeth, to the sisters who had saved me from despair. I told them about my life, about my husband and my children, about the happiness I had found because of their guidance. I thanked them for keeping me warm, for singing me to sleep, for teaching me that forgiveness was the only path to freedom. And as I stood there, I felt a warmth on my shoulder, like a hand resting there in blessing. I heard, faint and far away, the strains of that old familiar melody, the lullaby that had comforted me through the darkest nights of my exile. But the song was different now, lighter, almost playful, as if the singers were finally at peace. I like to think they found their rest at last, those ghostly presences who had watched over me through the darkest nights of my exile. I like to think that by witnessing the reconciliation of a husband and wife, by seeing love triumph over pride and misunderstanding, they were finally able to release the grief that had bound them to the mortal world. Perhaps they are together now, wherever spirits go when their work is done, reunited at last with the love they lost so long ago. As for me, I found my redemption in forgiveness, and my happiness in a love that was tested and proven true. I learned that the heart is capable of healing even from the deepest wounds, that trust can be rebuilt from ashes, that second chances are gifts to be treasured. I learned that sometimes the coldest winters lead to the warmest springs, and that the spirits of those who came before us are always watching, always hoping, always ready to help if we will only open our hearts to their guidance. I am an old woman now, as I write these words. My husband sleeps beside me, his hair silver, but his love unchanged. Our children and grandchildren fill this house with joy, and sometimes, on winter nights when the wind howls outside and the fire burns low, I think I hear a faint song rising from the walls, a melody I have never forgotten, and I know that I am not alone. I never have been, and that, perhaps, is the greatest gift of all.